Welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require any technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. With that, I'll turn the call over to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ben Hobbs. I chair the MSC, and I'm here with MSC members Jim Bushnell and Scott Harvey to discuss and perhaps adopt an opinion on market enhancements for the summer 2021 readiness, export load and wheeling priorities. The opinion was posted a couple of days ago. Hopefully you've all read it, and we'll have an interesting discussion about it. With me from the ISO staff, we have Brad Cooper, Anna McKenna, Greg Cook, James Friedrich, Christina Osborne, and I think Mark Rothleader also. Anybody else that I missed? Okay, and the agenda today, as usual, will. Yeah.
Don Trethewey also, Ben.
Oh, hi, Don.
If you didn't mention him.
Okay. Don Trethewey also here. Let's see. As usual, we will first have open public comment on any issues other than the particular one that we'll be talking about today on export load and wheeling priorities. And so what we do is I'll ask Shreya, the operator, if there's anybody on the phone lines who would like to make a comment or ask a question at this point on issues other than the opinion. Shreya, is there anybody who wants to ask something or say something?
Sure. To ask a question on the phone, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and affiliation. Once again, pressing #2 will indicate you wish to ask a question. I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
Okay. Thanks very much, Shreya. The next agenda item is consideration of the minutes from previous MSC meetings. However, I have not seen the revised minutes or some corrections last night. Does anybody know, maybe Christina, you know, did those get sent out?
You know, Ben, I'm not sure. I can send a text to Jim.
Okay.
Yeah.
So tell you what, let's just wait till the next meeting for that. We won't do the minutes now. Yeah. So let's devote the time to the opinion. Okay, so let's go now to our main business item, which is the discussion of the opinion. And the way this will be structured is that Dr. Bushnell will first summarize the opinion, and then we'll see if there are comments from other MSC members, and then we'll open up the phone lines for discussion. And then after that discussion, we will I will welcome a motion about adopting the opinion and, if appropriate, making any modifications. And we'll then have a vote. So, Jim, you can take it away.
All right. Thanks, Ben. So this is going to be a high-level overview of the opinion, sort of trying to hit on what I would characterize as the issues at play here. We're not going to get, or I won't get into some of the nitty-gritty mechanical aspects of the CAISO proposal in my overview. If we want to have some discussion about those after, that could be useful. and as you're all aware, some of those details were changing kind of up until and even after I think the opinion was finalized, or at least the draft was put together. So at times it was a bit of a moving target, and we were trying to adjust. So at the high level, and this is the last and most contentious set of issues having to do with the summer readiness package here. And there were two aspects of it. There was the treatment of exports and the treatment of wheels, which are linked in the sense that the demand for and role of wheels looks different when exports take on a different set of criterion as well. So I'm going to start with exports, and I'm going to frame this in a slightly new way, so we'll see if my colleagues want to challenge that in comments. But there are essentially three categories that were sort of in discussion here. There's energy that's created by resources that are clearly linked to resources under RA contracts or equivalent with California LSEs. And I think everyone agrees that that should not be exported. There is energy produced by resources that are clearly owned or under some kind of RA equivalent arrangement with an external LSC, but the resource is located inside of California. And I think everyone agrees that those should be that the external LSC has a right to that energy that's linked to those resources under contract to them. And then there's this third gray area, which is the energy that's purchased out of the CAISO's market, which is a pool-based market, and it doesn't and hasn't been explicitly linked to either category. And I view the refinements that have really happened since last August as trying to kind of tidy up this third category. And the proposal is intended basically to make sure that we don't have exports from Category 1, the resources that are producing energy from RA resources in California, and to allow exports from Category 2. And I will phrase it as creating sort of a burden of proof for resources in Category 2 to burden of proof of resources that might otherwise fall into Category 3, sort of the gray area, to identify themselves as belonging to Category 2. And that's where some of the master file requirements and other aspects of the proposal come in. Now, there are these mechanical challenges to doing that, to trying to sort of link energy to specific resources under an RA contract to internal or external. And you could do this by either excluding or including them actively in one or the other. And I think a lot of the sticky details here were how you do this, especially in the short term. The CAISO has a lot of ideas on sort of ways to do this maybe in a more concrete way in the future, but didn't feel like it could implement those sorts of checks quickly enough. And so a lot of this depends upon either implicit or perhaps explicit, I'm not sure the right way to characterize it, but identifications in the master file that a resource is under some kind of arrangement with an external LSC. And that would be a step necessary to qualify as an external resource that would get this export priority. Now, I think the comments have revealed potential weaknesses here. I think some issues particularly associated with the output of variable energy resources that are, potential vulnerabilities here. I just want to acknowledge those. I think basically the strategy was a lot of these more mechanical ways to try to verify the output of specific resources at levels of capabilities were judged to be impractical to put in place. And so this is also just trying to tidy up some ambiguities that have existed before. I think the other key aspect of the proposal is trying to kind of make more clear and revise the priorities associated with with different transactions that clear at different points of time in the market. Essentially, at a high level now, the proposal would basically place exports from Category 2. These are the resources that are verified to be under some kind of contract with external LSEs to have an equal priority with load. The timing of when they clear the markets would be less critical than being sort of explicitly linked to the being under some kind of arrangement with an external LSE. And we discussed this a bit. There was definitely some, I think, well, there was a lot of discussion and not necessarily, I think, concrete clarification about what exactly the treatment of resources in this category would be in other BAs. Not that the CAISO necessarily has to or has a legal obligation to treat exports of contracted resources in a preferential way, but there may be arguments as to why they might want to. And certainly external BAs have said that it's their business practice that if there is a resource that's owned or under some kind of contract with an external LSE, that they would not cut the export to if there's an energy shortage within their balancing area. And as far as I can tell, there isn't necessarily a contractual obligation or a NERC obligation to do so, but it was business practice. And there certainly was some back and forth about exactly whether this happens and how this happens, and I'm not in a position to judge that, except that I think it would be good for everyone to be on the same page here about what everybody thinks is the best treatment of resources in that position. And this is how Eastern ISOs and their neighboring non-ISOs have reached these kinds of reciprocal arrangements where everybody's on the same page about what treatment of resources that you could consider to be RA contracted resources that are located in one BA but contracted to load in another BA, whether they should have priority over native load or whether they should be in equal sort of status to them. I think it would be good if everybody could reach reciprocal arrangements there. So in other words, if CAISO loads expect their resource adequacy resources to be allowed to flow even if there's an energy shortage in the BA where those RA resources are located, then if that's the expectation, then the CAISO could consider providing an equivalent treatment as well. So that's basically where things stand on exports. I think there are these mechanical challenges, and then there's also this sort of high-level question about whether a rock-solid resource that's under contract with an external BA should have a higher priority even than load or should be in the equivalent priority status. The proposal will give them equal priority to load at the moment. Okay, I think the more contentious aspect of this, certainly the one that's taken up a lot more discussion time in the last couple of weeks, is the wheeling aspect of this. Okay, I'll start with a very high-level observation or framing that the challenge as I see it at the moment is that there may be more transactions with megawatt transactions with claims to, let's call it quasi-firm access to transmission than there is capacity of transmission in the CAISO. So in other words, there's an expectation amongst a lot of different parties to have a high priority access to the CAISO's transmission and maybe more of that than there is actually transmission. And so there's a risk of oversubscribed transmission, and there has to be some way to try to deal with that. Now, before I get to that, I want to think about how we got here at a very kind of design level, because we've had these discussions in the last week sort of internally about how how lots of people, including FERC and people who thought about ISO pricing from the beginning, kind of viewed these issues, where we don't usually use language like firm and non-firm transmission rights, because the idea was that the market would clear everything, and so we wouldn't have to make this distinction, that there's either people who are willing to pay enough for the transmission, or they don't want to pay for it, in which case they're not using it. And supply and demand would be cleared based upon basically congestion pricing. And where the problem comes in is if the market doesn't clear at prices that are high enough for supply and demand to be balanced. So in other words, if there's still excess demand at the maximum possible price that the current market rules allow. And that's basically where we are now, and that's where the idea of rights and priorities comes into play when we have to do tiebreakers, when there's excess demand at the maximum allowable price. And so sprinkled into the opinion in several places, we kind of make the observation that if prices were allowed to go higher, this problem may not go away completely, but may be reduced, because we would expect at least some of the demand for both wheeled and perhaps imports would decline if the cost in terms of the congestion price is substantially higher. And in fact, it could reach $2,000 or more if the 831 conditions are applied, and we'll see sort of how that affects the demand for these transmission resources as well. But the idea of the ISO framing then is that there isn't really this notion of firm or non-firm in a physical sense, because the whole idea was to not have transmission rights be physical, we want them to be feasible, but that they would be financial, and that allows for the efficient use in real time of the transmission system. And so it's really the financial rights that have taken on the role that the traditional kind of firm rights had played. Although in practice, there's this distinction when the market doesn't clear. And so CRRs, or financial transmission rights, are really the analog, or were supposed to be the analog under this setup. And here, there is some, there has been practice for how we assign those rights. They go to LSEs. In an allocation process, there's auctions for those rights for the residual amounts afterwards. There is an avenue, the OBALSI process, that allows for external LSEs to pre-commit through jumping through several levels of hoops and making certain advanced commitments of payments to also participate in that allocation process. We can get confirmation. My understanding is that there has not been much participation in that, so there hasn't been many people taking advantage of that form of transmission access, which is as close as we get to transmission to sort of firm transmission in the sense that how ISO pricing had envisioned this. I know some of the people involved in the legal definitions are going to sort of quibble with what exactly firm and non-firm means. So I'm talking at a conceptual sort of market operations level. All right, so the problem is we have excess demand at the price that's allowed to go for, and what do we do about it then going into this summer? And trying to kind of find some common ground here, but really the common ground really is just identifying where people agree to disagree at this point. I think people agree that balancing authorities have a right to reserve some transmission capacity to serve their native load. Now, it seems like there are disputes over the process for doing so. And I think the CAISO is very open that they have not done a process in the traditional kind of external VA way of defining exactly what the need for native load would be in a transmission capacity sense, and defining an available transmission capacity that can then be marketed in an open access, non-discriminatory way. And that's the root of the problem, is that there needs to be a process that does that. It's also, there seems to be some disputes over exactly whether whether it's too late or whether, what exactly a process that starts now, what kind of criteria it should have to meet. But I do think that that at the end of the day, there will be, if open access principles do indeed allow for native load to have a right to meet their reliability needs with the transmission that they have been paying for over the long term, that there will be some chunk that will be identified and assigned to California load in that way. Now, I do think there's a lot of disagreements over exactly what the process is, even going forward for getting there, but I think it's going to be more than zero, right? So native load, how much capacity do they really have a right to? In my mind, it's more than zero, and there's a lot of questions about exactly what the process is to get to that level. I think the CAISO's view, which seems reasonable to me, is that we do have this RA process for assigning import capacity, and that is, the RA is all about assigning or trying to determine reliability needs, and so as a proxy for kind of reliability needs, it seems like a not unreasonable measure. Legal process-wise are sort of another set of questions, but from an economic perspective, it seems like a reasonable proxy for what we think reliability needs are. There's reasons to think it's too conservative, maybe reasons to believe it's not. So what do we do this summer then? There hasn't been a transparent process. We have too much demand, and so we're going to have to do some kind of splitting the difference here. And the proposal has basically tried to identify, in a sense, the demand for wheels that has really made, that would have in another world made long-term commitments for purchasing firm rights on the CAISO system, although apparently they have not taken advantage of the Ubaldi sort of flavor of that. And that's where the spirit of the PT wheeling framing has come from. And it is trying to develop a set of criterion that implies that there is a quasi-firm reliant on a certain amount of energy that would qualify for a highest priority status, or the new highest priority status, which is going to be equivalent to CAISO load. Now, the concern is that we don't know exactly how much capacity is going to meet these criterion, and the proposal does not put in any kind of explicit cap on this. And so we cannot be confident that the sum of the PT wheeling qualifying capacity and the RA import capacity will be feasible. And the proposal recognizes this, and so there's a lot of effort put into what to do in that circumstance that would involve pro rata reducing the RA imports and the PT wheels in those circumstances. There are certainly other kind of flavors of this that could have been approached, but as far as this is where it is, and in terms of trying to enforce feasibility, it's going to be having to pro rata reduce the PT wheels and the RA imports. Now, the last thing I'll comment on is this question of whether there should be a requirement that PT wheels and RA agreements have the same sort of set of requirements for qualifying, or whether the transactions basically have to be very symmetric in different ways. And the proposal actually does try to link them in many ways. To me, the question is there, and I'll say that is there because that's kind of a legal question that I don't want to claim I'm an authority on, but there's also the economic question of should there. But is there a link between whether native load can reserve some of the transmission in its system for its reliability needs? So that's the question of should they be able to access their transmission or reserve it in a certain way, and how they then use that transmission in terms of what types of specific sourcing arrangements they make to use that transmission. I've heard arguments that in the traditional FERC 888 sort of process there has been a link. The economist in me thinks that doesn't seem efficient. It's not very efficient to basically link the transmission assignment to rigid contracts from specific sources. That's kind of what ISO markets were designed to try to get us away from in many ways, of having long-term arrangements that had to be rigidly adhered to when there are more efficient short-term arrangements to take advantage of. And that so at that level, the idea that RA capacity has to meet the same contractual requirements as say, a PT wheel to access the transmission is conflating the question of does CAISO load have a right to use its transmission with how it uses the transmission it has a right to use. And I accept that there maybe is some prior sort of practice that has made that link. I don't know how binding that is, but it doesn't seem like it's very efficient, and moving away from that sort of link has its advantages. And this is not to defend or attack, but I just think the question of RA capacity, specifically what form those arrangements take, is and whether they should be firmed up, whether there's good arguments that they should be, is a somewhat separable question from whether the transmission that native load in the CAISO system needs to reliably serve itself, whether those two things are linked. And to the extent that there are differences in what the RA contracts are and are not required to do, and what PT wheels are and are not required to do, I don't think that comes down to whether you think that the native load in CAISO does have some ability to reserve the capacity it needs, and whether the arrangements for a specific source are the way in which those reservations need to be made, or whether there's some more flexible way of identifying the capacity needs and then allowing more flexible procurement to take advantage of that transmission capacity. All right, so that's a high-level framing. You'll see that it's not like we're not taking a strong stance here. We're trying to lay out the issues as we see them and trying to be as open about the shortcomings or risks that might remain, while still acknowledging that this is a very tough problem and there isn't a solution, I think, that's going to satisfy everyone to the same degree, because just fundamentally we have a set of people that all have claims to a scarce resource, and not everybody's going to be able to get everything they want out of it, and so there's going to be some people who will be unhappy with that resolution. So I'll stop there and let my colleagues try to fill in the gaps, and then we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate your clear laying out of the issues and some principles and applying some of the principles. That was really terrific. I don't have any comments to add at this point. Scott, do you have anything that you want to say now?
Yeah, I guess this is Scott Harvey. I had a couple of thoughts about this. I think, as Jim said, the CAISO is struggling to find a rule here to define entitlements to use of the grid, which these interties, which isn't established by firm transmission rights over the system. So they've sought to limit the CAISO entitlement to the RA resources and not claim any additional capacity benefit margin above that. And, it seems to me that establishing a claim up to the capacity is in the framework of other markets and from designated resources to meet network load, and it provides a fair amount of room consistent with past usage for other balancing areas. We have to recognize that some of the limits on the use of on short-term wheel-throughs, since all the transmission to the CAISO northern border has already been sold, and the same transmission could be used to sell to CAISO or to a wheel-through, that's not really going to limit the volume of wheel-throughs through the CAISO. So that makes if we're going to have anything other than giving everybody spot access to wheel-throughs through the CAISO at $10 a megawatt hour, the LSC contract needs to be enforced. It's not clear how meaningful that's going to be. So it's a difficult situation, but I think the CAISO's taken a reasonable approach within the framework of what they can do for this summer, but recognizing it may or may not work, to everybody's satisfaction. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Scott. So at this point, let's turn to the phone lines. And Tria, can you see if anybody's queued up to ask a question or to make a statement?
Sure. As a reminder, to ask a question or make a comment on the phone, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and affiliation. I do see a few callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller.
Great.
Caller, the line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, you guys, this is Michelle Keto from the CPUC. I have just a couple of questions and some comments. So one is just a question, and this is one I've been struggling with, and it's hopefully an easy one. So on page 8, you guys say that for PT exports to get high priority in the real time, that they have to participate in the RUC process. And people have said that, but I don't see that in the proposal or the tariff language. So I'm just concerned where you say that it's sort of a reality check, and it's a good one, that I'm not seeing it in the tariff language or the proposal. So I'm afraid PT exports can show up in the real time where we thought it might have been serving native load.
Okay.
Thanks for the question. This is Brad Cooper. Maybe I can clarify. I believe that's it's not in our tariff language because I believe that that's an existing requirement, but we can double check that just to make sure and address that if needed.
Okay. That would be super helpful. That would give me some reassurance because, we just don't want unexpected things happening in the real time that we don't see in the day ahead. Okay. On another page, you say that the reason we're doing this, and I know that we're all going to be different about this, but it's because people have made summer commitments. But the way we're now writing the tariff based on the revised draft, it's not that people have made summer commitments. It's that people have made commitments 45 days before. So I just want to note that, that is a change that was made from the final that we had initially commented on. So.
Fair enough.
Right. Okay. So in recognition
of
the
the
fact
challenge here is, yeah. Okay. So then another change that was made, and we do appreciate some of the changes that we haven't totally digested, but we do appreciate some of the last-minute changes that have been made. But one of the changes that was made was the post-HASP allocation is now only going to be between RA and wheels, not all RUC imports. And so, going back to your idea that the premise is that you want CAISO to efficiently dispatch. So assuming that RA imports are, bidding efficiently, which is what we expect everyone to be doing, and they get displaced in that process, it seems odd that we only give them the RA portion of the allocation because we've done what CAISO wants us to do, right? Put all the resources in, let's efficiently dispatch them, and then we're sort of bid on the back end, right? Do you see what I'm saying? By limiting the post. Lee.
Okay.
So I think, the concern that I'm hoping that the changes addressed was the RA portion that may have bid economically and been displaced. Is your argument that, let's say, the RA might be more expensive than some other source, and it's ultimately going to be the expensive RA that gets the RUC award and not the cheaper market-based source?
Oh, no. I guess I was thinking, let's say that 4,000 megawatts of RA bid in, but only 2,000 megawatts got taken. And so we have 2,000 megawatts of wheels and 2,000 megawatts of just plain imports, right? So they beat out the RA imports. Okay. No infeasibility. We're all good. We go into the HASP process, and recall that the HASP process kicks in for any economic adjustment. So let's say LPT wheels come in at that point. There's now an uneconomic adjustment, and now we go to the post-HASP process, right? And in that post-HASP process, we're only going to compare RA versus wheels. There's no RA anymore, right?
So when does the RA get
IFM. It loses in the IFM.
Okay, so the RA doesn't. I see. So the IFM is feasible. RUC is feasible.
Yeah.
Is that in this scenario? Okay, so
yeah.
Okay, so the RUC extra schedule doesn't kick in.
Yeah. Right.
But at this point, so this is different than the point you were making on Wednesday.
Yes.
About
yes.
the PT wheel. Okay.
Yeah. So the point I was making on Wednesday is that PT wheels come in the real time and make us infeasible, right? And so then we have reliability issues. So sorry, I'm always trying to figure out what's going to go wrong. So my next wrong is that the RA imports, I mean, maybe this doesn't happen, but this is the idea, right? The RA imports get squeezed out by regular imports. Now, there's a question of whether that can actually happen given our rules, but who knows if we can, vigorously enforce them. But let's just say that they bid economically, like a CPM resource, for example, bids economically, bids high because it's, stress system condition. The economic imports get in. We're feasible because the economic imports were doing the work of the RA imports. We go to HASP. Now, remember, it's my understanding, maybe Don can correct me, but any economic or adjustment or whatever he calls it can trigger the post-HASP process. It doesn't have to just be load infeasibility or wheel infeasibility, right? So let's say an LPT wheel comes in and makes it infeasible to move us to the post-HASP process, right? So now in the post-HASP process, there are no RA imports. What happens then?
I don't know if anybody from the CAISO wants to try to chime in. I'm trying to still piece together the scenario. I think the argument here is that, so these would be imports that are the RA imports would be
this is Mark,
higher than $300 and might be displaced by LPTs.
This is Mark Rothleiter. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think what Michelle's setting up is the scenario where the RUC's not infeasible, therefore we don't push all the RA into the HASP. But I guess my point would be in that scenario we don't prohibit RA imports to come into the HASP. If they show up, they will be considered in part of the pro rata process. So I think the answer is that there's not a prohibition if they do show up and they bid. Anything that's bid in addition to what cleared RUC will be considered in the pro rata process.
Right, but in your process, RA
Correct.
imports or any import, RA imports that don't get a day-ahead award have no further obligation in CAISO system, right?
They don't have further obligation, but they can still make themselves available.
Okay. Okay. Well, I just want to note that that's, one potential problem, and that's why the initial proposal, it was the RUC cleared import schedule, right? Because we were assuming that imports that were in were displacing RA imports, and so it was a proxy for RA imports, right?
And the other point I want to make sure it's clear is that the RUC process is trying to solve against a high confidence load level. So if it is feasible, it's feasible in consideration of a high confidence load level. So I'm not overly concerned with RUC pursuing that high confidence load level, that if everything clears there, you're going to have an issue in HASP. So that's the other point I want to make.
Okay. And then I just want to try to understand the HASP process and how this works. So let's say that there's 4,000 megawatts of an import capability. You have 4,000 megawatts of RA imports and 4,000 megawatts of wheels. Wheels are going to win, right, because of the way the process works, if load is not infeasible, right? But then let's say load is infeasible, you commit the 4,000 megawatts of imports, so now we have a 4,000 megawatt tie and we have 8,000 megawatt resources trying to get across it. Do we call that feasible or infeasible? Because it's technically feasible because you've committed the RA imports, but it's infeasible because we know that they can't get in. So I'm just trying to understand what RUC calls that and what occurs as a result of that.
I'm sorry. In your scenario, are we able to meet the power balance constraints? Are we able to meet the load?
Well, I don't know. I mean, so you're infeasible, so you commit all the RA imports. So the RA imports now, do you call that feasible or not feasible? Because, yes, we can meet the load if all the RA imports get in, but we know that they can't, so no.
Yeah, I think what we call feasible is if we can meet all the load as forecasted and considered in the RUC.
Okay, so you'd call it feasible even though we know all those RA imports aren't going to get in real time. So we wouldn't have enough.
If I can meet load another way, that's still feasible.
Yeah.
So, in other words, it's not feasible in the hypothetical Michelle's saying, because she's saying that we don't have enough transmission capability to bring in all those imports, and then I think we'd say it's not feasible because we're enforcing the transmission constraints.
Right. Yeah. If the only way to meet the power balance constraint is to bring in more energy than the transmission can handle, then that would be infeasible, I hope.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay, so in that circumstance, we'd call this infeasible and we'd call an alert, right? Because we've committed all the RA imports, but we know we're only going to get maybe half of them because the wheels are there, right?
Right. In that scenario where we can't meet the power balance constraint, but for the imports that are now behind the constraint, that would be an infeasibility, and that would be a scenario where we would force all the RA into the real-time process.
Okay. So now, when you force all those RAs into the RUC process, do they tag? I mean, who's tagging here? I'm just trying to understand the mechanics of this. Who gets to tag?
I'm sorry. You said the RUC process.
At which point in time are we talking about post-HASP process, Michelle?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to understand. Well, so here's the deal. So a lot now has to occur in the post-HASP process, right? Because now we've told 8,000 megawatts we told the wheels you're good to go. We told the RE imports bid into the real time. So then in the post-HASP process, I guess I'm just trying to understand, do we then say, hey, 2,000 megawatts of wheels, you're not tagged ORA, you're tagged, and that all occurs in the post-HASP process? And is it going to work? That's kind of what I'm asking.
If they're tagged already.
Mark, this is Anna. Oh, I'm sorry. Go on.
If they're tagged already, and then something needs to get cut, that tag will be cut. If they're not tagged already, and we get out of the process, we give them effectively a schedule. That schedule should be then tagged after we finish the administrative post-HASP process.
Okay, and all that can occur in post-HASP process, right? All that tagging and untagging.
Yeah, there's tagging time up to T-minus 20, I believe, minutes before the hour.
Okay. So another, in the next proposal that you put in some stuff about Path 26, and so the allocation process is really going to be the RA resources that are bidding in the north minus the north load. But the way the calculation is going to go, it's going to count the NQC of the resource, not the PMAX. So let's say all resources in the north are the NQC of those resources, and they're all RA. The NQC is 15,000, but the PMAX is 20,000. So we're trying to move those resources, which are technically RA resources, right? And we're not really going to get credit for that when we're allocating the Path 26 constraint. And so, it's just, I mean, I'll just express my frustration. We've tried to do the right thing by, making the NQCs correct. But here, we're going to get penalized because, our resources might be trying to generate more. Like we've reduced the NQC of the hydro resources, so, or, maybe hydro's not the best example, but, the NQC of the hydro is, 8,000, but they're, let's say 3,000, but they're running at 6,000 because it's stress system conditions, and we're trying to move that to the south. That doesn't really get included in that proration. Is that right? Okay. Well, you don't have to answer.
Michelle, I appreciate your examples that you've created. I cannot, I can't think through all those on the fly. We can certainly have more detailed discussions with you about how the Path 26 method would work, but I can't just answer that on the fly.
Okay. Well, I've thought through it. I think I've confirmed it with your folks, and it just concerns me because it is RA resources, and so if we're trying to reserve that valuable transmission and move literally RA resources that are generating above their NQC, we don't really get credit for it. So it's just another one of our concerns. So then finally, I guess this is really a question. Sorry, these are the technical questions, but on sort of a broader level, and I do think that Jim Bushnell sort of laid it out, and it's, the scarce transmission capacity. But given that, we are going to, if there are 4,000 megawatts of wheels because the transmission isn't binding and if the contracts aren't binding, we know we need the RA imports because CAISO's studies basically say, we need our historical imports plus every resource to reliably operate the system. So if we don't get that, it's likely that we'll have, some sort of reliability issues. And given that it could potentially make us resource insufficient and it could lead to scarcity pricing precisely because we can't get to the, RA imports, isn't it important that we address this particular issue first before we do scarcity pricing and before we do resource efficiency? Because it's going to affect both of those things tremendously. And just wondering if you could give your thoughts on that, the sort of timing and scope to the MSC.
Okay, thinking through on the fly. I'm not sure whether sequencing, certainly simultaneous might be better, but I will observe that the scarcity pricing component here is part of the solution. And so I don't know if solving some of these transmission allocation questions is necessarily something that needs to be resolved before scarcity pricing, if scarcity pricing makes the need for transmission allocation unnecessary.
No, sorry, I don't really get that entirely because from my point of view, if you build your system and you need the 4,000 megawatts and you only get 2,000 of them, you're going to hit scarcity pricing. So to me, you should decide if you're going to get the 4,000.
No, the idea is load needs this transmission. They have CRRs. If the congestion price hits whatever, $4,000, $5,000 a megawatt hour, they're willing to incur that because they have the hedge. The demand for wheels may not go away completely, but would be greatly impacted by an extremely high congestion price. And so the idea that there's oversubscribed demand for the transmission it may not resolve it completely, but it certainly would reduce the demand because the cost of the wheel goes up by however high the congestion price can go.
Right, but that's just for that hour, and then we're potentially, that's balanced against loss of load. To me, it just seems like we should decide whether we're going to get 2,000 or 4,000, and then, and then deal with the scarcity, right? Well, anyway, that's just me.
Michelle, to go beyond what Jim said, I mean, if we put in place some kind of firm transmission service, if there's this really low cost to wheel across, that's going to make, and the price is much higher outside, it's going to, because our price is artificially low, that's going to make it very attractive for outside parties to buy the firm transmission service because it'll be cheap compared to, we're not charging them enough to wheel across our system. So I think they need to go together.
Okay, well, going together. I just don't want scarcity pricing to go first because it seems like this is sort of foundational for how this goes forward. And, I get the open access argument, and I guess, my feeling is, and maybe I'm wrong, is that open access doesn't really mean you get equal access to our transmission system. I always thought it meant you get equal access to the excess transmission. And so maybe that's just where I fundamentally misunderstood what open access was about. And so, to me, this really, what we're doing right now kind of undermines our transmission planning process. It undermines our TPP planning process, and it seems like we need to get this right before we can move forward, because this seems like a big deal to me. But, okay.
I think,
thank you.
As I understand it, I agree with your framing of the open access is for the amount in excess of some degree of needs to serve retail load. I think the disagreements are over the process for defining what that is.
Right.
But I do agree with you on the principle that there is some right, and it doesn't, I think, well, I guess there's also some question about whether it needs to be linked with how you use that transmission, but even if that is sort of the legal precedent, that seems like an unfortunate one.
Okay. Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller.
You, Phil. Caller?
Yes, moving on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Partha Malvankar with PG&E. Thank you, Dr. Bushnell and Dr. Harvey, for this discussion. Can you hear me?
We lost you for a second, but you're back now.
Great. Thank you for this discussion. Maybe I can sort of continue on with that topic you were just having on sort of the rights to native load and the process going forward. One of the sort of changes that the ISOs, or one of the sort of the issues that ISOs was grappling with early on was sort of, is there a point in which you should cut off additional transactions from occurring, such as sort of limiting it to contracts signed at or before the filing date. And this is how I was sort of thinking about it, was to some degree, I think that you really described the issues very well, Dr. Bushnell, in terms of there was some uncertainty in the past, or sort of maybe expectations set that parties could flow under any circumstances across the CAISO system. And that I think what's been made clear right now is that given sort of the existing uses existing needs by CAISO BA load to serve their native load obligations and sort of existing wheeling transactions, the system is likely fully subscribed. And particularly, I think about that example of Path 26 for the internal constraint. So I just was wanting to get your thoughts on sort of, should there be really a process to sort of cut off additional transactions that are not feasible given sort of these existing uses of the system? And if so, what would that look like? What might that look like?
Okay, so here's where I think the legal constraints and the common sense constraints and the economic sort of best practices kind of come into conflict, I think. So my understanding of the idea of the cutoff dates, and CAISO can chime in, it was one of those considerations where there's just FERC filing timing and what's reasonable to sort of say as a cutoff date, and and how that interacts with the timing of just what the summer would look like, and they kind of were bowing to some reality of those constraints. I think where you were going is kind of an alternative framing that would try in some way to define what the capacity needed for serving retail load might be, and then sort of limiting how much would be sold as, let's call it quasi-firm, to be some measure of a gap between the estimated capacity and the estimated amount that's serving retail load. And I do think there's an interesting sort of trade-off here where right now there's PT wheels and there's native load, and they're lumped into a basket, and there's potential they'll both be pro rata reduced. Would it have been better to have a smaller amount of, let's call it PT wheel, that would have had a firmer status associated with it? It's a hypothetical question or a rhetorical question at this point, I think. But it is I think that's where we will end up in the future, is the idea that once we have more confidence that we're constraining the amount of high priority access to be something that's close to feasible, or with margins added, feasible in most reasonable expectations, then we can afford to rethink some of the prioritization as well. I just will let Kaiso sort of chime in, but it seems like both in terms of creating, just in terms of the actual analysis side of it, and then the actual kind of just legal process boxes that need to be checked, there just wasn't any practical way to do it for this summer, and maybe I don't know how long that would take, because this is sort of a new terrain, I guess, in terms of open access analysis, in the sense that there's been practices that have been in place for a while, and we're revisiting what they mean in 888 terminology and precedent. So it's a long-winded saying. I think I agree with kind of the spirit of what you're saying, but I think the Kaiso would say that it's just not a practical thing they can implement right now for this summer.
No, that's helpful. It sounds like, at least from the discussion, and I really appreciated your conversation with Michelle and your description earlier. It sounds like, for lack of a better term, for the summer of 2022, there's not really a good reason why incremental, infeasible transactions, wheeling transactions, should be allowed as a PT status. There should be a way that, under sort of every other open access rule and sort of the way that FERC approached the open access tariff, it really allowed for BAs to set aside transmission first to reasonably meet their reliability needs, and then only make residual transmission available for new and incremental transactions. And so we might be where we're at for 2021, but for 2022, it sounds like, at least you're sort of saying that would be a reasonable way to try to establish a claim and grant additional service.
That's my understanding of sort of what an analogous outcome would be. I don't want to push too far, because I do know there's disagreements about what exactly is proper in that world. But yeah, I think that's sort of my understanding of a high-level framing, is you identify the network needs to serve native load, and there has to be a transparent process so that the BA doesn't just grab everything by making wild claims about its needs. So, there needs to be some approved transparent process for that. But once that's in place, then yeah, there's an amount identified reserved for serving native load, and then there's an amount that can be marketed, and we can have discussions about. It seems like if the first stage is conservative, and if there's excess capacity, that some of it could be sold as firm, or I don't want to use that terminology too much, could be sold as sort of high priority. but that the rest would be low priority and would be kind of the equivalent of non-firm. That most of the time it's available, but if things do get sort of cut. Now, I don't want to get too far into the details because there is also, we want to be mindful of trying to preserve as much of the ISO pricing structure as possible within that. And so to me, there's a real attraction to using the CRR framework as the basis for these distinctions. But I think those two things can overlap. But my personal sort of thinking is that we would go in a direction where there are CRRs with maybe some tiebreaker rights associated with them. But there's all sorts of things to work through if we went in that direction as well.
One thing I just want to add, Arthur, to your comments is while you can have rights to meet the native load from your designated resources, I think the issue is that once you've done that, and then if other balancing areas buy firm transmission across your system, long-term transmission, you can't bounce them if you decide you want to buy from different resources the next year. If they've bought the long-term transmission at embedded cost, and then you change your mind and say, well, I'd actually like to buy more over that interface, you can't just bounce them off. So that's the sense in which it's, you can always get the additional transfer capability if no one else wants it, if no one else wants to pay embedded cost. But once someone has paid embedded cost and contracted for that transmission, you can't bounce them out because the economics have changed and now you want to use it.
No, thanks for that too. Yeah, I'd 100% agree that obviously it would need to be embedded in the transmission and basically the transmission planning process that in effect those rights are being sort of held at a comparable basis as serving load. So yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, that's all the questions I had. So yeah, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Partha. Shreya, do we have others on the line?
Yes, I see a couple more callers in the queue. Moving on to the next caller. Caller line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bobby Olson with Project in Phoenix, Arizona. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, you're fine. You said Bobby Alton, A-L-T-O-N, from SRP?
Bobby Olson, O-L-S-E-N.
Okay, thank you.
I wanted to say thank you for letting us take the opportunity to kind of ask some questions. I think one of the things that I'm hearing here is a real focus on kind of open access and whether or not CAISO has an internal load reservation process, and I think those are all reasonable discussions, but I do want to take this a little bit higher level and kind of recognize that the real challenge that is presented in this proposal with respect to wheel-through modifications is it really has to deal with not the congestion on Path 26, it's the congestion that occurs external to the CAISO BA, that the CAISO proposal for wheel-through, that effectively the CAISO BA is trying to impose its own priorities and obligations onto other BAs in terms of how they address it. And the analogy that I would use for everyone to kind of root it into something other than the details of the economics and how the things dispatch is, I want to liken it to maybe we're looking at a multi-leg flight from Portland to Sacramento to Los Angeles to Phoenix. And I got to stop at each one. It's a terrible flight plan. But the challenge that we're seeing here is that load-serving entities in CAISO have purchased a standby ticket for a flight from Portland to Sacramento or a flight from Portland to Los Angeles. And the challenge that's occurring is that they're showing up on these days and the plane is full. There's no opportunity to take a seat on that plane. And so as a standby ticket, they're left in Portland. And the proposal here is that they would want to kick off someone who has a destination in Phoenix on the basis that they had someone that they wanted to get on in Portland. Now, if you wanted to kick someone off in Sacramento, headed to Los Angeles, and prioritize someone else, you could do that. but you can't tell us that we can't travel from Portland to Sacramento simply on the basis that we're going to Phoenix. If you want a seat on that plane because you might need it, you need to pay for a full ticket. You got to buy a seat. And I think it's a tough analogy, and I don't mean to be too firm on it, but I think it's an important analogy to distinguish here, is that you can't buy a lower priority, kind of maybe a chance or a potential to sit on a plane and then get frustrated when you don't have that right to do so, and then ask and instruct Portland to take us off in that particular case. And I think you can get into the economics and you can talk about the bid process, but that's the fundamental rights issue that's here. And I think the MSC should be careful in their opinion of focusing on kind of the rights and opportunity as it pertains to the CAISO balancing area, imposing its obligations and suggesting that a standby ticket from Bonneville or anywhere else has a right to go before someone who has a seat on the plane and stops every spot along the way.
Well,
I'm really
I think
concerned.
part of that analogy is good, but let me jump in here. I think that it's better to say some people have bought a ticket from, Portland to Sacramento, and then the CAISO load has bought a firm ticket from Sacramento to L.A., and then some people have bought a firm ticket from L.A. to Phoenix. But the reality is no one's bought, no external loads have bought firm tickets across the CAISO. They're the standby customer. They haven't bought any.
Yeah, but I don't think you can.
But
I don't think you can kick me off until I land in Sacramento. What you're asking us to do is kick us off in Portland.
No, but the thing is, you can still get to the wheel, but you can't go through. So it's like you're not going to want to fly to Sacramento if you're not going to be able to fly on to get on to Phoenix.
But the only reason why you're not letting me keep going is because you've got someone left in Portland. And I know I'm probably using an odd analogy. I think the analogy effectively kind of works, but you can't kick me off on the basis that you had someone that you wanted who didn't make the flight before.
Well, I like my analogy better, that we've got people that have bought firm transmission service on different segments, and they all want to make the whole trip or groups of trips, but no one's bought firm service over the path they want, and we're trying to sort out the entitlements when no one's actually bought firm service over the entire path they want.
Well, and I think if you had left me stranded in Sacramento in that particular case and your energy got stranded or your passenger got stranded in Portland, then I think that that's probably where we wind up, but that's not really the case. The intention is to try and figure out how to get that standby from Portland so that I don't ever wind up in Sacramento. So it's a really odd analogy, but
I do like the analogy. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I do like the analogy, but I agree with Scott that the ambiguity is, like, who's got the tickets from Sacramento to L.A.? And if a wheeling transaction is basically literally saying, I only want to go from Sacramento to L.A. if I can get from Portland to Phoenix. And you don't want to get to just Sacramento.
Right. Well, it's the wheeling transactions that are showing up at Sacramento in this particular case, right? And I think that's the frustration that you're hearing, is everybody else is kind of left at the previous airport, and there's frustration that they're doing that. So, but it seems that there's a lot of focus on what are the internal rights, and I just want to kind of step back and recognize that the priority challenges are the way that congestion is handled across the West is it's responsible for the BA that has the congestion to manage congestion internal to its balancing area. And this proposal is choosing to prioritize and manage congestion based on an external congestion constraint. And I think that's where it goes awry here.
Meaning that it's because the PT wheel requires firm transmission access? Is that where the managing based on external constraint comes in?
Yeah, it's in this case, we have PT wheels that show up with that firm transmission. We will show up with that firm transmission. And I think the concern that I hear in terms of crowding out RA contracts and those types of things is you want an option and you don't want to have to pay for it if you don't have to. And that creates a lot of uncertainty and unreliability and there's frustration when you had the option and it didn't show up. And it's priced accordingly. It's a lower price option. They don't have the priority. And so others will buy the priority as they see it needed. So I think there's a pool market, as you referenced, Jim. But I think the struggle that we get to is it's kind of looking at it and going, hey, that result didn't work for us. We're going to change the result of those other markets. And I think that's where we're really starting to have some process. I don't think there's
this argument that it's influencing outcomes in other areas. I think that's true anytime you have connected network resources. So while there's a real issue with whether there was sufficient opportunity to get firm access through CAISO, I think that's a different question than whether having access through CAISO affects your ability to use access elsewhere. If for whatever, if there were an established process that did grant rights to CAISO load internal to CAISO, then that would still have an effect on what transactions are able to do upstream and downstream of CAISO. And so I don't really see this as there's sort of an unavoidable consequence of transactions within one BA having a spillover effect on transactions in other BAs that seems to be kind of distinct from this question of opportunity to get access to CAISO. Anyways, it was a very helpful analogy, although I think, as you've seen, people can then take it in all sorts of different directions as well.
They really can, and it's the purpose or kind of the point that I'm trying to illustrate is, tickets were never sold for anyone to effectively buy within California from that particular perspective, and so I think you're hearing lots of frustration and concern from both parties. Or both sides of the argument. I think it's really about kind of trying to understand how we can reach a compromise that recognizes kind of the frameworks that exist across the West and not just trying to take the framework that CAISO prefers and desires with respect to kind of the most economic solution at all times being what binds and governs both inside its borders and starting to impose that outside its borders.
But I think the CAISO has, gone pretty far in this proposal of limiting its claim to, and making to the use of its transmission system for wheeling across its system to its historic RA, and it's making a lot of capacity beyond that available to wheel-throughs that haven't used that in the past. So in fact, there's people that never wanted to buy a ticket from Portland to Phoenix and stop in Sacramento now want to. And that's the issue, that I don't think the CAISO is actually, and we talked to them a lot about this, and I think they got a lot of pushback on expanding the use, defining the curtailment in a way that expanded their entitlement to the use of the transmission system beyond what it had been in the past, even though it was the CAISO transmission system. And they're trying to give all the entities that did not want to use this in the past but decided they do this year an opportunity to use it and to, in fact, curtail CAISO load at times if the CAISO needs more economic imports, or if there's a derating in the CAISO, not everybody's RA can flow. So, nothing's going to make everybody happy, but I think, the CAISO's gone pretty far in drawing a reasonable compromise given the ambiguity of everybody's entitlements across the CAISO, and these interties are partly paid for by the CAISO ratepayers. So you can't just say that, okay, because we bought transmission through the Pacific Northwest, we get a right across CAISO. And you wouldn't accept that if someone next door said they get a right across your system because they bought some rights across New Mexico.
Well, I don't think there's an advocacy that we shouldn't pay for wheel through rights. I'm not suggesting that. I think I would dispute or kindly disagree with the concept that this hasn't really been done before. Now all of a sudden we want to do it. It's a significant portion of how energy flows on a day ahead and daily basis. So I'll end my comments at that and just recognize that I recognize it's contentious. We know that CAISO has worked with us. We appreciate the work that they've done to kind of reach out with us. But it may feel like it's gone far, but there are still things that we think haven't gone far enough.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for the question and comment, Bobby, and I certainly will remember the airline standby metaphor. Sacramento is not a bad place to get stuck in, by the way. But if we could go to the next person on the phone line, Shreya.
Sure. Moving on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Doug Bocignone from Fund Resource Consultants for CalCCA. I just wanted to add on to this discussion that I think it's important to recognize that the CAISO's transmission planning process models the north to south paths as being fully loaded, and the southern paths in the CAISO are also very, very heavily loaded. And I think represented in that might have been some amount of wheel-through transactions, but it's not some huge volume. And I think, that there's some attractiveness or appeal of using RA contracts or capacity as some kind of proxy, but that quantity is much lower than what CAISO was actually assuming was flowing into California on these interties. And so I think when we're thinking about longer-term solutions, it's going to be critical to really think about, well, how has this transmission been used historically? And, before we start opening up access to that transmission on a priority basis, you have to look at, the native load does have a right to use the transmission it's embodied in the Federal Power Act, and it doesn't link to contracts with specific generators. And I don't think this isn't unique to California. Other BAs look at their overall needs. It's not just linked to designated resources. So I think this is going to require a lot more analysis before, and I think there's some risk in the approach we're taking for this interim period of, essentially, now that there's additional need to wheel power through, we're sort of changing the priorities from how they've been used in the past. And then I just want to make an additional comment about what Mark Rothleader was pointing out. If the RA resources don't clear day ahead and aren't needed for RUC, they can still voluntarily participate in real time. One thing I'm concerned about is that, what would be the incentive for an entity to be bidding in to the CAISO, the RA resource, as just a sale to CAISO versus a wheel, and could we have situations where there might be greater incentive for the wheel transaction to occur? Because I think what we'll find is the same parties are selling the power for the wheel as the RA. I'm not saying it's the same power, but they're making the choice on the bidding. And could there be sort of problems created by that?
Thank you. Would anybody like to address that?
Well, I guess this is Scott Harvey. I think we agree. We see the tension between the two views, and we do understand that on a planning basis, a lot of the transmission is modeled as going to CAISO load, and the wheels over the northern interfaces are going to locations within the CAISO, not the Southwest, and from what I understand. So, yeah, but the thing is, the CAISO we were in this difficult position, Doug. I think you acknowledge the CAISO hasn't established, a firm transmission service for people to purchase, so the CAISO is trying to do a rough justice here in what they make available. And we share your concerns about, the same entity might have the firm transmission to the CAISO border, and it could use it to sell into CAISO, and it could use it to sell into the Pacific Southwest, and it might even have the capacity that if it doesn't clear in the day-ahead market, they could sell it into the Southwest in real time. But something has to displace that in the day-ahead market, and I think CAISO's done its best as it can. It's hard to see how simple changes that would provide more fairness to both parties, I think.
Well, I'll just add on that one specific sort of situation. There was a revision very late about the day-ahead PT wheel and the amount of PT wheel that can qualify for the pro rata process in real time that would, I think, mitigate that specific problem of trying to sell it sort of day ahead and then to one party and then use it as a wheel afterwards.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's a helpful addition, because if it wasn't scheduled day ahead, there's some limits on the incremental amount that can go in real time. So that's helpful. But, I'm thinking more towards the longer-term solution on, as a balancing authority area, I think it would be irresponsible to be making like a long-term firm sale of transmission across the CAISO system that didn't take into account how that transmission's been used to serve load.
Yep. Fair enough. We're getting and now everybody's getting an echo.
Okay. Thanks. We're getting close to the end of the hour and a half, which would have been scheduled. Operator, is there anybody else? And let's see if we can make the comment brief and to the point if there is anybody else.
Yes. I see a couple of callers in the queue. Caller line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes, good morning. It's Mark Holman with PowerX. I just wanted to follow up on Bobby Olson's comment at SRP, which I agree with, and I think there are some issues that he's raised that are not really contemplated or fully understood in the MSC's opinion, and just wanted to express that again, which is, when we take a step back and we look at this, we've acknowledged this morning that the CAISO does not have a forward physical transmission right procurement framework. They have not had a framework that has either identified any set aside for load service or allowed open access competition for entities to come in and compete, both wheel through and imports, to secure that service. So that doesn't exist. So we're in this difficult situation. But let's talk about what does exist. So what does exist is all of the external transmission providers on these very schedules that we're talking about do have an open access framework, and there has been competition, and entities have secured transmission rights. We also have forward markets where both entities in the desert Southwest serving load and CAISO load serving entities have competed and secured physical supply delivered on that open access transmission to the CAISO border. So as an example, we have Northwest Supply on firm transmission to the CAISO border that's under contract, import RA contracts with CAISO LSEs. We have Real Physical Supply on firm transmission delivered to the border that is intending to wheel through the CAISO under contract to serve Southwest LSEs. And if we just looked at those transactions, said, okay, those are the entities who went out there and appropriately competed through open access to secure transmission, competed to secure real physical supply, and if that is all we were talking about giving priority to, perhaps in many, if not all cases, there wouldn't be any congestion at the import location on the CAISO's transmission system, and no problem for the CAISO to solve, because the entities that competed with each other for forward supply and for transmission service, and the entities that won that competition and secured that in the competitive marketplace are now flowing. And I think what Bobby was getting at is what this proposal does, unfortunately, is it allows a third category into the mix that creates the illusion of physical congestion on the CAISO grid and disrupts what happens in what the outcomes were in the competitive forward markets and what the outcomes were for securing transmission that is needed to get to the CAISO boundary. And that is including import RA contracts that LSEs have entered into with marketers that don't have an identified source, may not have transmission to the border. They're showing up in the day-ahead time frame without that. They don't have an E-tag. And we're adding that to the mix and then doing some form of pro rata curtailment when there shouldn't have been any curtailment necessary. And then by doing that curtailment, I'll use Bobby's analogy, we're kicking off the passengers that won the competition for the transmission, for the real supply upstream, so that marketer can then go out there and buy that supply or buy that transmission. Suddenly there's a standby ticket available because we kicked someone off the plane upstream. And I think that is missed in this opinion. We very much appreciate the tremendous hard work that CAISO has done to try to find a solution here, but I do not agree that they took all steps that were available to them to resolve this, in continuing to include supply that's not real in the RA program, that there's no identified source, there's no commitment of transmission, and then extend that into a pro rata allocation in the summer season is inconsistent with the proper functioning of forward competitive markets and what everyone else does. What everyone else does, they don't kick wheel-throughs off their system until an import shows up with an identified resource, transmission secured, and E-tag, and this proposal falls short of that. And so again, appreciate the hard work. I know this is a tough issue. There are a lot of important issues that need to be resolved in the future to get to the right outcome, both for CAISO, the Desert Southwest, and the transmission customers throughout the West. Appreciate the hard work, but I think it's an area where we're struggling.
Thank you, Mark. Any comment or thought? I know that this was extensively discussed yesterday also. Jim or Scott, staff?
I can say the same thing. I think it's still a question of, entities bought firm transmission rights to the CAISO to sell to the CAISO, and now they decided they want to get an entitlement to free transmission across the CAISO to sell to other customers. And I don't think they're entitled to free transmission across the CAISO, but I think the CAISO should, try to find a balance here in providing some transmission across the CAISO, but I don't think it should be completely just displacing all the CAISO loads that paid for that transmission within the CAISO. And, I just disagree. I think the CAISO is trying to reach a balance, and it certainly isn't an imperfect one. And I think going into differences of how you think the RA program should be done is not the same as the transmission allocation.
say what Bobby said. Nobody's asking for free transmission. Nobody's asking for free transmission. I wasn't really saying that, discussing that the RA rules had to change. I'm saying extending that and doing a pro rata allocation that includes supply where there's no identified source, no transmission identified that's been secured to the boundary. For the CAISO to do that is inconsistent with the practices of everyone else that respect each other's e-tagging and transmission allocation frameworks.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah. Ben, I'll just say quickly on the first point that, I think the way to look at it is external entities haven't paid for firm access, but in the same vein, they haven't. Well, they largely haven't had an opportunity to, although there is the proxy of the All-Ballsy process, which is as close as it gets to that, and there hasn't been a lot of activity there, it sounds like.
Well, they also presumably could have intervened in the CAISO transmission planning process and said, we want to pay for you to, add to the plan to build firm transmission, across the CAISO from the northwest to the southwest, and no one was intervening in that price, right, Doug?
I think it's pretty complicated to try to bring in somebody. All right, Ben, let's see what other comments there are. Sir?
Yeah. Shreya? Is there anybody else?
Yes, I do see a few more callers in the queue. Caller line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hello. This is Ian White with Shell Energy. One thing I just wanted to point out real quick, and again, totally appreciate the work that the CAISO has done here to try and get the OAT framework in the West to mesh somewhat with the framework which exists in the CAISO. Understand that certain things, certain aspects of each are not perfectly reciprocal with each other, but and this is certainly a sticky subject. But one thing about the final proposal that kind of caught me off guard is the CAISO's requirement that an entity seeking firm wheeling transmission across the CAISO footprint through use of a PT wheel must have transmission of a certain quality upstream. That to me, just from the, I wanted to ask a question about that and get your thoughts. It seems to me that conditioning firm access on CAISO system to an entity which holds certain firmness of transmission in another region is problematic, considering that in the OAT bilateral West, if I have firm transmission across PNM per se, or PNM doesn't weigh the decision whether or not to grant me access firm transmission across their system based upon what transmission is in my portfolio in another region. And that's something I just don't know if that's prudent and if that's reasonable for the CAISO to require, to condition access to firm transmission access on the level of firmness on Bonneville system or whomever else is. It just doesn't, we don't see that framework exist within the rest of the West, so I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
This is Scott. I think that's a very fair minimal requirement of the CAISO's card, because all the firm transmission to the CAISO's border has already been sold. So it doesn't restrict anybody, because there's all that transfer capability that could be used to schedule firm, RA imports to the Southwest. And all this does is say we can't have people bidding in 8 times the available capacity to prorate down the CAISO RA, and they can put in lots and put in thousands of megawatts of phantom transactions to prorate down the CAISO and get through. This just is, established. I mean, it's not perfect because the CAISO can't sell firm transmission rights and is making some capacity available, but I think you have to look at this as a fair rule to provide some limit on the system, the rules being gamed so that the CAISO gets 1 megawatt of RA through. And it's a pretty loose limit, it seems to me.
Yeah, I'll add. Yeah, I don't think this is the idea of what a long-term framework would be, and it might look odd to have this external link, but exactly who that benefits is sort of ambiguous. That, in a sense, the idea of trying to require a purchase of firm rights on the system you're getting firm access to is to limit the demand for it because it's expensive to get a month's worth of firm access. And in a way, what the rule is doing is it's trying to limit by making the people who want PT wheels pay for firm access, but the money's not even going to the CAISO. It's going to external BAs that's also buying a sort of bundled preferential access to the CAISO as well with that purchase. So, yes, it's very odd, but it does, as Scott said, there has to be some way of trying to bound the amount of PT wheels, or else you just might get some very large number that enters into the pro rata access. And so, as a, triage proxy, it doesn't strike us as the worst.
Thanks for that. I think that. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I just acknowledge it's not the long-term solution, but it's not an unreasonable thing to do in the short term as we consider alternatives for the long term, and hopefully the West as a whole evolves towards a more rational and consistent management of congestion. I'd like to go on to other comments because we are short of time. Thank you, Ian. Shreya, do we have anybody else?
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right. So at this point, we'll turn to the opinion itself, and I'd like to entertain a motion to adopt the opinion.
Scott moves to adopt it.
And I'll second. And let me just say I really appreciate all the feedback we've gotten from everybody, and if it's not reflected in the opinion as it's written now, that's as much a process constraint as anything. It's very difficult to get these things written in a moving target sort of environment like this, and so we do really appreciate this feedback. But
yeah, the CAISO's proposal has made everybody sort of unhappy, so that's one recommendation.
Yeah. And, of course, this is, as everybody acknowledges, this is not the end of this issue. It's this process will be continuing, but at least we'll get through the summer. All right, so Scott has moved and Jim has seconded to adopt the opinion. Let me ask if there's any discussion, amendments, changes, anything else?
Not from Scott.
Not from Jim.
And neither do I have anything. So, all right, so then I'll call the question then. So this is a vote to adopt the opinion without changes, the opinion entitled Opinion on Market Enhancements for Summer 2021 Readiness, export load and wheeling priorities. And Scott, how do you vote?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
And I vote yes, so it's been moved, seconded, and voted unanimously to adopt the opinion. And so the final version of this will be posted today or on Monday. Again, thanks everybody. This has been very intensive between the stakeholder meetings such as yesterday and the discussion today. And as Jim said, we really do appreciate the input, and it certainly will be useful when this gets revisited in the future, and so we look at the longer term issues and try to come up with longer-term durable solutions. So at this point, if there's no further business, hearing none, Shreya, we can now conclude the call, and I wish everybody a good weekend.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Services. You may now disconnect.